Okay, so I think we'll make a start. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, part of our Zenfi Automation Stories series. My name is Steve Heaney. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Zenfi. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a really exciting new feature we've just released, and that is Zenfi's Intelligent Document Processing. And I'm going to show you how we can use this new feature to automate a really common process in just about every business, and that is the process of accounts payable, invoice routing, and approval. On today's call, we also have our CEO, Vahid Taslimi, and he will be helping out with moderating this session. We will have time for questions at the end of the demonstration today, and we'll have an open Q&A, but please do feel free to post any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll do our best to get to those as we go along. So just a bit of a recap for hopefully most of you on the call, but what is Zenfi? Zenfi is a no-code process automation platform that's been designed specifically for Google Workspace. It has seamless integration with all of the Google Workspace apps, so Sheets, Docs, the Google Directory, Slides, you name it. And it can be used to automate everyday business processes really, really easily. It's just a matter of finding the right actions in the toolbox, dragging them onto the design canvas, and stringing together these to build out your process and to automate it. Zenfi is used to automate all kinds of processes within a business. It could be leave requests, expense approvals, HR processes, HR onboarding, pretty much everything, you name it, Zenfi can do it. What we like to say that is if you can visualize your process as a flow chart, perhaps you could draw it out on a whiteboard. If you can do that, then you'll be able to automate that process in Zenfi just with a few drags and drops. It really is that easy. So this new feature, I hear you ask, what is this intelligent document processing here from Zenfi? Well, let me just give you a little bit of background. So in just about every business, or even in our everyday lives, we all use documents to transport information. We often use PDFs, it's a very common format, to send forms across to other organizations or other people to be filled in, and they return those forms once they've been completed. We have documents that are printed out, signed and sent back to us as scans. And that's all great. It's a great way to get the information around, but it's not so great when you need to extract information from those documents and use it in a systematic manner, such as part of a process, and to be able to automatically take decisions based on the information that's inside of those documents. Well, that's where Zenfi's IDP comes in. We're basically using artificial intelligence to extract key information from those documents so that you're able to use that information and take decisions inside of your Zenfi flows. The way we do it is you basically go into Zenfi, you create an AI model, and you can train that with some sample documents. And then you can use that model inside of your flow to automatically process and run over those documents that you're bringing in and extract the information that you need. Now, with the launch of this feature, we're shipping with 5 generic AI models that you can use and customize to use in your flows. We have a document OCR model, where this is basically if you had a page of text and you wanted to be able to digitize all of that text and use it as part of a process, then you'll go ahead and use that OCR model. Now, they can understand 200 different languages of typed text and can even understand 50 languages of handwritten text. So quite a powerful AI model there. The next one is a forms processor. So if you had quite a structured form, it could be a government form, perhaps a tax form that needs to be filled out where it's got fields in the exact same place every time, or it could be a template that you use with your customers that they fill out when they need to make orders from you. Using the form processor, you can tag up various parts of that form, different places in the document, extract that information very, very easily. We have a generic invoice parser. Now, this particular model has been trained with thousands of invoices from all different suppliers, and it's used to pull out information that's common to all invoices that you might need. So, for instance, the due date, the supplier name, the amount that's due, the tax amount, and there's quite a number of other fields that it pulls out as well. This is actually the model that we're going to be using in today's demonstration. Likewise, we have a receipt parser that's built specifically for pulling out key information from expense receipts. And finally, a utility bill parser, which is specifically designed to pull out key information from utility bills such as electricity, gas, telephone, and the likes. As we progress with this capability, we will be releasing more AI models as time goes along. So that brings me to today's challenge, and that is the accounts payable process of invoice routing and approval. So just about in any organization, you'll find an accounts payable department that is responsible for receiving and processing invoices that come in from their suppliers. Now, typically, the way these would be received is they'd come in to an accounts payable email address as an attachment, and you'd have an accounts payable clerk who would be responsible for opening up that email, opening up the attachment, looking through the invoice that's been sent through, pulling out key information, then trying to identify which cost center in the organization and which manager needs to actually go ahead and approve that invoice before it can be paid. And so it may be a process of manually forwarding that email off to who they think is the right person to approve it. It might bounce around a little bit, it might come back. And then finally, once it has been approved, then the accounts payable clerk can then schedule that invoice for payment. Now, the problem with this manual process is that it is very time consuming. And typically what will happen is your accounts payable team will batch this work up into once or twice per month. And it is quite a block of work they need to go through and sift through all these emails and go through all of those invoices that have been received. Being a manual process, it is quite error prone. Chasing up the managers that are involved can often lead to delays. And ultimately, you could get into a situation where you're making late payments to your suppliers. So I'm going to show you how we can automate this whole process end to end using Zenfi and Zenfi's intelligent document processing. So what I'm going to show you today is I'm going to show you how we go ahead and we create an AI model specific for invoice parsing. We're going to be using sheets to map our suppliers that are sending us invoices to the relevant cost centers and therefore the approvers within those cost centers who need to approve those invoices. And then finally, we're going to build out this flow in the Zenfi Flow Designer. So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look. Okay, so here we are inside of our Zenfi tenant. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is that we have this new menu item called AI Builder. This is how we get in to start designing our AI models. So the first thing I need to do is go ahead and create a new AI model specific for invoice processing. You'll notice here that the available AI models that I have to choose from are those 5 that I mentioned earlier. So we have document OCR, form processing, invoice parser, receipt parser, and utility bill parser. And we will add to this list as we get more demand for new models. But today I'm interested in the invoice parser. So I'll go ahead and click create. From here, I can give my model a name. So I'll call this invoice processor. And what it's telling me is that you need to upload some sample documents so you can start to train this AI model. So I'll go ahead now and I'll upload some sample invoices that I've got. One here from Founders Suite. And what's happening now is Zenfi is processing this document, looking at all of the available fields and using the artificial intelligence to automatically pull out common properties for this particular invoice. So you can see I've got some highlighting going on over here. On the right-hand side, here are the different types of elements that I can select and use in my AI model. I'm just going to go ahead and turn some of these off so we don't clutter the page. Tables here, though, is showing us information that it's discovered in tables. So in this instance, it has found these tables within the invoice that we could use in our flow. We have document properties. So these are tagged key value pairs that it has picked up. So invoice number, date of issue, due date. Basically looking at a key value pair, and that's the way that it interprets this information. Now, being an invoice specific model, what we're really interested in are these common invoice properties. So these are properties that the AI model has already been pre-trained and is looking for in every type of invoice document. If I turn these on, I can see here that it's collected these common fields like due date, supplier name, and the total amount. These are actually the fields that I'm interested in that I want to use in my flow so that I can route this invoice accordingly and get it approved. So what I do is I go ahead and I say due date, yes, that's something I'm interested in. I add that to the output, calling it due date's fine. Supplier name, I'm also interested in that one. And finally, the total amount due, I'll add that one as well. And the other interesting thing of note here is this blue bar, green bar here showing us the confidence of the value that's returned. So the AI model is saying that for due date, I'm 99% confident that this particular value is in fact the due date from this invoice. Likewise with supplier name, when we get down to total amount due, even though this is correct, the AI model is telling us that it's about 70% confident that that's the correct value. And we can use that confidence level in our flow later on to make decisions about whether or not we need to take the output from the AI and run it past a human just to verify the values are correct. So if I like, I can go ahead now and add in some other invoices. So I'll upload this Zenfi invoice that I've got here. And in the same way, we'll see that the values that we have asked to put into the output, it's trying to detect those in this particular invoice, and it's gone ahead and found those as well. So I can see here we have our supplier name, we have our due date, and we have our total amount. So this is working quite well. Now I could go ahead now and I could put in as many of these sample documents as I like, just to verify that it is in fact going to pick up the fields that I need from each of the type of invoices that are likely to be coming through. Now, you don't need to, you can see I've got these ones here. You don't need to upload every single type of document that's likely to come through to this AI model. The AI model is smart. This is just giving you some samples. If you get an invoice from a new supplier that you haven't put in the samples for the model, that's okay. The AI is still going to try its best to process that particular invoice and pull out the information that you have asked for. Once I'm comfortable with this model, I can publish it. And I can now go ahead and start creating my flow and make use of this particular AI model. So I'll just jump back into flows now, and I'm going to create a new flow. And remember, this process is going to kick off when a new email arrives to my accounts payable inbox. So those of you who are familiar with Zenfi, you'll know that we have this concept of triggers. Every flow has to start somehow. You could have one that starts on demand, have one that starts based on a schedule or an API call. You could monitor a Drive folder or a new Google form. But in this instance, I'm interested in starting the flow when a new email arrives to that accounts payable inbox. So I'll go ahead and select the new email trigger. This brings me to the Zenfi design canvas. The first thing I need to do is go ahead and configure this trigger. So I'll click on that. It's asking me for a connection to the Google Mail account that I'm going to be monitoring. Now I've already created one here for accounts payable. You could just go ahead and authorize that if you hadn't had one already. Now we have this concept of conditional runs. I don't want this flow to start on every single email that arrives in my accounts payable inbox. I want to make sure that it's coming from a supplier. I want to make sure that it's got an attachment with an invoice that I can process. So I'll click on this conditional run, and I'm going to say when, and you can see here I've got access to all of the information that's coming through on that email that's starting this flow. But when the attachments collection, the count of attachments is greater than or equal to 1. So that's going to ensure that there is at least one attachment on this email before I start this flow. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, also, don't run this flow when the email that's coming in is from myself. And so in this case, that would be accounts payable at demo.zenfi.com. Because you'll see later when I'm sending around some approval tasks, I don't want those to also kick off another flow. So I'll just put that exception in there, and that will make sure that this flow doesn't start off whenever I email myself. Okay, so now I've got my trigger configured. The next thing I'm going to do is I need to get access to the first attachment that came through. Because emails can have multiple attachments, an attachment collection, what I actually need to do is I need to query that collection and return the first item. So the collection I'm going to be querying is my attachments that came in on the email, and I'm interested in getting the first item that came through. Now that I have that first attachment, I can go ahead and use my new AI model that I just created. So down under artificial intelligence, you'll notice we have a new action here called run AI model. I'm just going to drag that one on. And what I do here is I select the AI model that I just created earlier, that invoice processor, and it's asked me, what's the document that you want me to pass through this AI model? Where am I going to be looking for that particular information you're after? So in this case, I've already got a suggestion here. It's the file contents. I could click that, but what we're looking at is from that query collection, from the item that we selected out, it's the contents of that particular file. Now you can see here on the output of the AI model, here is the extracted information. So this is the information that we configured when we created that AI model. We said we were interested in the due date, the supplier name, and the total amount. If we had selected additional fields, they would also be available in the flow here after the AI model has run. And I also mentioned those confidence scores. So we want to know, how confident is the AI model that it has found the correct information that we're interested in. And we return those confidence scores into Zenfi, so that you as a flow designer can take decisions based on how confident the AI model was that it found the right information. We have a confidence score for every property that got returned. It's a confidence score between 0 and 1. And we also calculate the minimum confidence score in case you're interested in just looking at what's the minimum score, and if it's below a certain threshold, then forward this off to a human being to get reviewed before you continue on with your flow. Okay, so now that I have done that, I've run my AI model. I'm going to go ahead and create a few workflow variables to hold the information that it's found. So go into configuration, create a variable. I'm interested in the supplier name. Let's make that a string. I also want to get the total amount and the due date. Okay, and so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a set a variable and just set those values. Supplier name, coming from my AI model, the supplier name, drag on one for the due date. Set the due date. And finally one for the total amount. All right. Last of all, I'm just going to log this to the history list so that I can run this flow, run the AI model, and see what we get. Supplier name, and I'll put in that workflow variable. Amount, due date. And I'm also going to log in here the confidence score so we can see what that looks like. I'm going to use the minimum confidence of all of the scores that we have. Okay, so I give this flow a name. I'll call it invoice processor, and I'll publish this flow. And now it's all ready for us to test. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to jump over to my own inbox, and I'm going to compose a new mail message, and I'll send it to accounts payable, and we'll call this Optus invoice, and I'm going to attach a sample invoice. Attachment going, send this off, and what we'll see here is this will arrive into our accounts payable inbox. momentarily. There it is. And if we go back to Zenfi now, and we have a look at our recent runs, we should see that there is a new flow that's started to execute because that email has arrived. And if I click into this, I can see what's going on. It's run the query of the attachments. It's running the AI model. Give this a refresh again. Seeing the variables. And finally logging that information out to the history list. So we can see here, out of that invoice, it's pulled out the supplier name, the total amount due, and the due date. And it's telling us that it's a confidence score of 90% or more. So it's fairly confident that this is the right information that we need to use. Okay, so that's great. So thinking about this process, what I want to do is I actually want to go ahead and check that confidence level to make sure that it is correct before continuing on with the rest of the process. If the confidence score is less than, say, 80%, then what I want to do is I want to send that off to a human being so they can review the values before we move on to the approval steps and the other parts of the flow. Because this is going to be operating in an inbox, what I can do is I can make use of Gmail labels to help me categorize these emails, and so I know where they are up to within this process. So what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to create a new label, and I'll call it invoice processing. And I'll add another one for in progress. And I'll stick that under my invoice processing label. I'll add another one for approved or payment. And finally, we'll add one for rejected. Okay, so I've got these 3 labels here, and as the emails come in, I'm going to use Zenfi to automatically categorize these emails so that they arrive into these different labels here, or into these different folders, if you like. So jumping back to our flow, let's move on to the next step. So we've got our invoice processor here, and we've run our AI model, and we're happy with the values that we got back. The first step I'm going to do in this flow is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a label to categorize this particular message. The message ID is going to be the ID of the email that came through on the trigger. And the label that I want to add is invoice processing in progress. Now, so that this particular email message disappears from the inbox, I'm also going to remove the inbox label so that it's only in that other invoice processing folder. Again, the message ID is the message of ID of the email, and the label I want to remove is inbox. So this is just going to ensure that that email is automatically categorized within the accounts payable inbox. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is I want to check the confidence score and make sure that it's above a certain threshold. So I do that by dragging on an if condition. And I'll give this a name. I'll say check confidence greater than 80%. Configure this condition, and I'm saying when the AI model minimum confidence score is greater than or equal to 0.8. Okay. So in the scenario that the confidence score is greater than 80%, that's great. But when it's not, what I need to do is I need to send this back to accounts payable and say, hey, we received this invoice. These are the values that I've extracted from the invoice, but I'm not 100% sure that's the right one. So can you please check those for us? And the way we go about doing that is we use a request data action. So I'm going to drag that on now. And this is like a task. So I'm going to be sending off to accounts payable. And I can design a form here. So I'm going to be saying, please verify invoice details. And I'll add in here the supplier name. And I can actually put in here the value that the AI engine has returned. So from my variables, I'll add in the supplier name. I'll do the same for the amount due. And finally, the due date. Okay, so there's my form that's been created. In the notification email that's going to accounts payable, I'm going to be saying, please validate AI values from invoice. And please complete the form using the following link. That's fine. I'll just change this to please review the attached invoice and verify the values returned. And what I can do here is I can actually add as an attachment the original attachment that ran through that AI model. Okay, now if I wanted to, I could go ahead and configure reminders for this particular task, and likewise I could configure an expiry. But in this scenario, that's all I'm interested in. I just want to get them to verify those values. Once they've submitted that form, I then need to take the values from the form and stick them those back into those workflow variables that I'm going to be using later on. So once again, I'll drag on my set of variable. Supplier name. This time I'm going to be getting the supplier name from the form. So this is the updated supplier name that the accounts payable clerk has verified and checked for us. Likewise with the due date. And of course, also the amount due. Okay, so now I have checked that my confidence score is correct. And if it's not, I've sent a task off to the accounts payable team and asked them to verify the details that have been returned from the model and update them accordingly. Okay, so my confidence is good. The next thing I need to do is I need to use the supplier name to go and look up who from the business needs to approve that particular invoice. So I've created a couple of sheets here to help me out. This first one here I've called suppliers, and we have here the suppliers listing and also all of the cost centers. So these are all of the cost centers within my organization, and the email address of the person who needs to approve each of those cost centers. Now, for the purpose of this demonstration, I've just set the approver email to myself, but of course this would have the various heads of department or the owners of those cost centers. In my supplier list, I've got the supplier name, the approver cost center. So it's saying any invoices coming in from Zenfi need to be approved by the CIO. And I'm using a lookup formula here to go and look up in my cost centers sheet and find who the approver email is. So within our flow, I'm going to be looking up in this sheet and finding the supplier name based on the supplier name that's come through on that AI model. So the first thing I need to do is look up a row in a Google Sheet. I've got my Google Sheets connection there. Here I'm going to go ahead and select that supplier sheet that I've created. And the sheet name, suppliers. I can say this has a header. I can load the columns. And I'm going to be searching in the supplier name field, and the value that I'm searching for is my supplier name variable. And I'm interested in returning this information, particularly the approver email. But there I've gone ahead and looked up the supplier. Let's rename this to Lookup Supplier. Now, it's possible that I'm receiving an invoice for the first time from a new supplier that is not currently in my sheet. When that happens, this lookup row is going to be returning empty values. And what I need to do is I need to register the new supplier. Now, I could just let the workflow fail and send a message to accounts payable saying, hey, you need to process this one manually because we don't have the supplier registered. Or because this is Zenfi, I can automate the registration of a new supplier as well. And that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now. So first I need to check to make sure that whether or not we have actually found a supplier. And the way I do that is I can just go ahead here and I can say when the lookup supplier, when the supplier name is null, and I'm going to actually reverse this logic. So I'll say when the supplier name isn't null, then I want to continue on this way. I'll call this supplier exists. If the supplier exists, I can go ahead and set my approver based on the value that I got. So I'll just create a workflow variable to store the approver information. And if the supplier exists, I can go ahead and set that variable. Just getting the approver email from that lookup row. However, if the supplier doesn't exist, I'm again going to use our request data action to present a form to the accounts payable clerk to say, please register this supplier and tell us which cost center should be approving these invoices moving forward. So I'm going to drag on my request data action. And I'll configure this up. Again, the recipients is going to be my accounts payable team. And I can start building out this form. Please register new supplier. And I can put in here my supplier name that we have. And what we're really interested in is the cost center of who will be approving these invoices. Now I can make this a drop-down list. And if I wanted to, I could go ahead and input all of those possible cost centers here as options that can be selected in the form. Or I can use this dynamic options capability. Now, the way that this works is that I need to hook this up to a collection that I've found inside of my flow. So I'm going to go ahead and create that collection now. So I'll just jump out of this form. And I'm going to look up rows this time. Oh, sorry, read rows from a sheet. I'll just go ahead and drag that on. And the sheet that I'm going to be reading from is a supplier list. It's got my cost centers in it. And the sheet name, cost centers. I want to get the whole sheet back. You can say it's got a header, load those columns, and that's the information that we're getting back. Now that's returning a two-dimensional array of the information in that sheet. What I need to do is create a single dimensioned array that I can use to hook up to that options list in the form. And the way I go about doing that is by using a project collection action. So drag that on. The collection that I'm going to be projecting from is my read rows rows, and the field that I'm interested in is the cost center description. So just a quick look to see what that looks like. The cost center description is made up of the cost center code hyphenated with the description of the cost center. And that's what I'm going to be displaying in the drop-down list to select the cost center for this new supplier. Okay, so I can jump back into my form now and hook that up. So where I've got cost center here, I want to add dynamic options, and I can bind this to the result of my project collection. Let's clean up these other ones there. And so this is what my form's going to look like. Very simple. I could expand on this if I wanted to, but this is just saying, here's a supplier name. Please tell us which cost center we need to send this to for approval. In the notification email, I'll just say register a new supplier. And please register the new supplier and allocate to a cost center. Okay. Once again, if I wanted to, I could choose reminders and I could have an expiry on this, but for the purpose of this, that'll do me. So now that I've got that, the cost center, what I need to do is then go and update that supplier's listing so that all future invoices from that supplier will also get allocated to that cost center. So what I need to do is I need to pull out from that form the cost center that's been chosen. Now, because it is a hyphenated value, what I'm going to actually do is split that using a regex split. And the text that's coming through is going to be from my form, the cost center value that was selected, and I'm just going to split this based on the hyphen. That's going to give me two parts. And so what I need to do then is query the collection of parts that's come back from that. And I'll say, give me the first part of it. So the collection is going to be from my regex. And I want the first part of it because that's the actual cost center code. Now I can add a row back into that sheet using my add row function. And once again, the sheet that I'm adding back into is that supplier listing. And the sheet name is suppliers. Load those columns and say, okay, so what's the supplier name? That's from my workflow variable, supplier name. And the cost center code of the person who will be for the person who will be approving it is coming from that query collection. And the approver email gets dynamically looked up, so I don't need to set that. Okay, so now I've added the row into that suppliers list. The last thing I need to do is just go ahead and look up that approver email now. So now I'm going to use a lookup row similar to what we did before. And this is going to pull back out the email address of the approver that we're interested in. So I'm searching where the supplier name equals the supplier name variable. And I'm really just interested in that approver email. So I'll retrieve that column and I'll do a set a variable to finally set the approver email address. Okay, so now on both sides, I'm setting that approver email. I've ensured my supplier exists. The final thing that I need to do is just go ahead now and send off that approval task to the cost center manager. So I'll drag that on. This is just a straightforward assign a task and approve invoice for payment. Can be approved or rejected. We're going to be assigning it to the approver's email that we got before. Please approve invoice. In the email body, I can say, hi, please approve the attached invoice for payment from your cost center. And I can go ahead and once again, just attach that original invoice that came through at the beginning. I could set up expiries and reminders here if I wanted to, but for now, that'll do me. Now, if the manager has approved this, and I can check that by just dragging on an if condition, I'm going to say when the assigned task outcome is equal to approve. In that scenario, what I want to do is I want to add a row to this approved payment sheet. So this is going to be my payment schedule, if you like, for the accounts payable people to know that these payments have been approved for payment. So I'm going to go ahead and add another add row in here. And the file I'm looking for is the approved payments sheet. And I can fill out these values. So for the supplier, put in my supplier name. For the due date, I can put in the due date, the amount, who it was approved by. So we have that information as well. And if it's been paid, it's not going to have been paid yet. That'll be something the accounts payable team will fill out. Okay, so I've added that row. Now, finally, I'm going to add a label to the initial email to move it out of that progressing stage and put it now into approved for payment. So using the message ID, the label that I'm interested in is approved for payment. Now, if the manager declined this payment and rejected it, I'm going to move the email into the rejected label. So these are the labels that I created earlier in my Gmail inbox. And finally, in either case, I need to remove the in progress because it's now completed. Message ID, and I'm removing the label in progress. Okay, so now we have a completed flow. So I'll go ahead and publish this. And we are ready to test. So once again, I'll compose a new email and I'll send it off to accounts payable. This one we'll call it Aussie Broadband. And I will attach an invoice. And send that off. Here's our test email from earlier, so I'll just remove that one. Okay, so now we're waiting for that Aussie Broadband invoice to come through. There it is. And the flow is going to start and it's going to move that email message into the in progress folder. And that's what it's gone ahead and done. So now let's have a look at the flow and see what's happening here. So we'll go to recent runs. You can see we've got our new instance executing. And away it's gone. Now you'll notice here that the confidence score of this particular invoice is only 74%. And as such, it's now sent off a task to our accounts payable team saying, please verify the values that you've received. So if I jump back into the inbox here, I should see a new email, a new task that's been assigned saying, please validate the values. So I can look at the invoice here and see what we've got. Okay, $89, due date there, and it's from Aussie Broadband. Okay, so now click on the task. And it's going to load up that form. Now it's pulled in the values that it's read from the invoice, Aussie Broadband as supplier, $89, and the due date. That actually all looks correct. I could go and make changes here, but that's okay. So I'll submit that off. And let's go back to our flow now and see what's happening. And the flow has moved on. So now it's gone into that lookup supplier job. And what it's actually found is that, hey, the supplier doesn't exist. And so what it's gone now is into that register new supplier task. So I go back to my accounts payable team email, and I have a look in here. We've now got another task saying, please register this new supplier. I bring up the form. It's saying, please register Aussie Broadband, and I can choose here which cost center within my organization is going to be responsible for approving that particular expense. I'm going to give this one to CFO. So I'll submit that. If we have a look now at our suppliers sheet, you can see that we've got this new row added now for Aussie Broadband, CFO, and it's got the approver email in there. So now any future invoices coming from that supplier will automatically get routed to this particular approver. Now, as the approver, I have a task. So as the cost center owner, it's saying, please approve this task, this expense. I can see I've got the original invoice here. Am I happy with this? Sure, I'll approve it. Hit the approve button, and the manager has now approved that task. If we go back and have a look at our flow, it continues on to execute. It has received that approval. It's added a row into our approved payments sheet here. So here we are here, Aussie Broadband has now been approved for payment. And if we have a look at the original email, we have a look here in this invoice processing, just refresh this. We should see that we have now this approved for payment, that particular invoice, and that's the end of the process. So I hope you can see there, it's sort of fully automated end to end, using the power of the AI to extract the information we need to take decisions within our flow and fully automate that accounts payable, invoice processing and approval sort of end to end. All right, I'll just jump back to the slides for a sec now. So just a quick summary of what we saw today. You saw that I just very easily was able to create an AI model specific to the invoices that I'm going to be receiving from my suppliers. I had the option there to create different models for different types of documents, but I used the generic invoice processing model. I created a flow that started whenever a new email arrived into my accounts payable inbox, and I used labels within Gmail and updated those labels from within the flow to manage the status and to keep track of those invoice emails and where they were up to in the approval process. Using the AI model in the flow, we're able to extract the information that we needed. I used the AI confidence level to make sure that the information was retrieved from the document with a high confidence level, and if it wasn't, I sent that off to get verified by a human. I used sheets to map the suppliers to cost centers and handled the registration of new suppliers if it was a new invoice we hadn't received before. We got the approval from the cost center owner. And finally, we added it to a payments schedule in the sheets ready for payment by finance. Now, if we wanted to extend this further, we could have moved on and integrated into say QuickBooks or Xero or some finance app and automatically set up those payment schedules as well in there. Okay, so with that, I think I'm going to open up now to any questions. Let's have a look.
Thank you, Steve. So we've had a few questions coming through. I'll start with this one saying that, can you use a model across multiple flows?
Good question, and absolutely you can. So you saw how we design the model separately to actually creating the flow. And so you can create as many models as you like. And then when you're designing your flows, when you drag on that run an AI action, you can just select the model that you're interested in. So you could repeat and use that same model across multiple flows, no problem.
Okay. And a follow-up question to that one is the reverse of it. Can you use multiple models in a flow?
Yes, absolutely. So you could just drag on multiple instances of that AI action, and in each action, you could be selecting a different model. You might have a flow scenario where you're branching based on some condition, maybe based on whose the email is coming from. You could be running one model versus a different model if it came from a different person.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, what document formats do you support other than PDF?
Okay, yeah, so in addition to PDF, we also support image formats, so JPEGs, PNGs, TIFFs, scanned documents. Our models can read from those as well as PDFs.
Okay, the next question, I believe you had answered at the beginning of the webinar, but I'll repeat that if you don't mind answering it again, is what languages do you support?
Okay, so it is multilingual. The OCR model, for example, like when you're trying to digitize some printed text, if it's typed text, the model can interpret 200 different languages, so quite extensive there. And it even supports some handwritten text as well. So 50 different languages of handwritten text it's able to digitize as well.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And the next question is, can I use a custom document format? I believe the question is, if someone has got custom document format in their organization, which is not a standard format like invoice, expense, or utility bill, can they run AI model on that document format as well?
Sure. So it might be a custom order form template that they send to their customers that they need to fill out when they're placing an order, something of that nature. Absolutely. So you would, in that scenario, rather than using the invoice parser AI model, you would look to use the form parser AI model. And when you're training that form parser, you would give it some samples of that custom form doc or a custom document that you're looking at, and you would tag up the different pieces of information that you're interested in. You'd be using the key value pairs that I showed during the demonstration. There's also another capability which I didn't show, where you can actually highlight areas of the page if you know that the information is always going to be in that same location. And then when the AI model runs, it's always going to be looking for text information within that area that's been selected. So there's a couple of ways you can use your own custom document formats and create an AI model there.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, the next question is that how do you charge for this service? I can take that question, Steve.
Sure.
So yeah, this service is we charge per use. So we don't charge per number of fields you extract from the document. It's just actually every time that you run a model on a file, we charge, you get charged. Now, in terms of the pricing, if you head to our pricing page on our website, zenfi.com/pricing, you'll see the detailed information about how much does it cost to use each one of the services. So, so yeah, head there, have a look. There's you can find the information over there. Steve, we've got a few more questions coming through, but I guess since we're you've gone a bit over time, maybe we can answer these questions over the email. We respond back. I mean, I've taken a list of note of all the questions which have come through, and we'll respond back to you over the email.
Okay, no problem. Well, we'll wrap it up there. I'd like to thank everybody for their time today. I hope you got something out of the webinar. If you do think of any other questions after the call, please feel free to shoot them through on the email, and we'll get back to you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.